Welcome everyone to the 5th annual CVMA National Issues Forum. I am Dr. Henry Seelan, a large animal practitioner from Eastern Ontario and the chair of the National Issues Committee of the CVMA. At previous forums, we have engaged veterinary team members from across Canada and around the world on topics important to our profession, including dog importation, telemedicine, cannabinoids in veterinary medicine, and alternative veterinary medicine. This year, the forum will explore veterinarians as leaders on adaptation to climate change. As you can see, the subjects we tackle at our forums are challenging, critically important to our profession and team members, and this year in particular, of great significance to all Canadians, to our patients, our environment, and our planet. How we as a profession can help lead in adapting to climate change is of significance today and will remain so for decades to come. CVMA has taken what we have learned at the forums and turned ideas into action, including developing positions and leading advocacy efforts that have resulted in changes that benefit our patients, our clients, and our colleagues. This is the first time we have done an online forum, and we are excited to open up a discussion on this year's topic with our largest convention registration ever. CVMA has used online tools to engage with members during COVID on a number of topics, and we hope to continue this into the future, including by hosting a combined in-person and online annual national forum. As chair of the National Issues Committee, I'd like to invite you to explore other ways you can engage with your colleagues on important matters that impact our profession. CVMA has many volunteer opportunities on committees and working groups. Please get involved with CVMA, the only national organization that provides a voice for our profession. We would love to have you join us. Without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our moderator, Dr. Katie Clow, an assistant professor in One Health in the Department of Population Medicine at the Ontario Veterinary College, University of Guelph. Her research focuses on the ecology and epidemiology of vectors and vector-borne zoonoses. She also conducts research more broadly on One Health. Dr. Clow holds a Doctor of Veterinary Medicine from the Ontario Veterinary College in 2011 and a PhD in pathobiology in 2017. She has worked in private small animal practice as well as at the national and international level in One Health through internships at the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, the Department of Food Safety, Zoonoses, and Foodborne Disease at the World Health Organization, and the Global Disease Detection Branch of the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention. Dr. Clow regularly collaborates with public health professionals and veterinarians in private practice and industry. Dr. Clow will introduce today's topic and our three esteemed panelists. Dr. Clow, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Seelan, for the introduction, and welcome everyone to the 2021 National Issues Forum. As Dr. Seelan mentioned, each year the CVMA chooses an issue pertinent to the veterinary community and provides a space for learning and sharing. In order to situate ourselves for this year's topic, I first want to share some photos. These are photos that most of us have seen as we've watched the news or scrolled through our social media feeds. These are also photos that many of us have been deeply troubled by, especially since we have taken an oath to protect animal health and welfare. The first image was taken at the beginning of what will go down in history as the horrible year of 2020, where much of southeastern Australia was ravaged by forest fires. We were flooded with images of burning koala bears and dehydrated kangaroos. Sadly, these images continue to replay themselves, and we are dealing with extreme forest fires in many areas of North America, including in Canada. In this photo, we see a polar bear on a small patch of sea ice. Sea ice loss, which has been occurring at a frightening rate, makes it difficult for this iconic northern species to hunt and survive. Catastrophic flooding has been reported at increased rates around the world. Right now, Western Germany and surrounding areas are grappling with some of the worst flooding in centuries. This photo was taken in Texas following the massive storm of Hurricane Harvey. And here we see another photo from Texas, and this time of an extreme cold weather event. And so this image shows cold stunned sea turtles, which were fortunately rescued from the ocean. And so we know that all of these images have something in common. They're all connected one way or another to a changing climate and the climate crisis. And they depict impacts that we have and will continue to see on animal health and welfare, as well as human and ecosystem health. But fortunately, our news feeds have also been flooded with images like this one. Calls for action for systemic change to address the climate crisis from around the world. People stepping forward and being active players in the fight against climate change. And so that brings us to the topic for this year's National Forum: Veterinarians as community leaders for adaptation and mitigation to the climate crisis. Our forum will begin with presentations from 3 outstanding leaders in the field. Dr. Jonna Mazet will kick off the presentations with Converging Crises, Veterinarians on the Front Lines. This will be followed by Dr. Courtney Howard, and she will share her experiences with mobilizing the medical profession to take action against the climate crisis. We will conclude with Dr. Craig Stephen and building a climate change action agenda in veterinary medicine. Following these presentations, the forum opens up for questions and discussion. I want to emphasize that this forum is meant to be a dialogue and that your contributions are important and valued. In order to facilitate this, there's a question voting tab on the Chime platform, and your questions and comments can be placed at any time throughout the presentations and the question and answer session. If you do have a question that's specific to a speaker, please preface your question with the speaker's name so we can direct the question appropriately. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Mazet to kick off our forum. Dr. Mazet is the Vice Provost of Grand Challenges and the Chancellor's Leadership Professor in Epidemiology and Disease Ecology at the UC Davis School of Veterinary Medicine. Her work focuses on global health problem solving for emerging infectious diseases and conservation challenges. She is active in international One Health education and service and research programs, most notably in relation to pathogen emergence, disease transmission among wildlife, domestic animals and people, and the ecological drivers of novel disease dynamics. She is the founding executive director of the UC Davis One Health Institute, the co-director for the US Agency for International Development's One Health Workforce for the Next Generation, and the Director Emeritus of the PREDICT Project. She was elected to the US National Academy of Medicine in 2013 in recognition of her successful and innovative approach to emerging environmental and global health threats. So welcome, Dr. Mazet.
Well, thank you so much for having me here. I'm incredibly honored as for the 3 decades of my career, I've always been looking to the amazing environmental education that I believe the Canadian veterinary medical system provides. And I know that we as humans on this planet have been dramatically changing our environment since the beginning of civilization. And unfortunately, we're really feeling it now. So I think this is a very appropriate topic for this forum, and am again honored to be here. So I wanted to just start out and recognize that so much of veterinary medicine evolved to protect the food supply. But even now, our food supply is in question. We have many people around the world, including in all of our home areas, who are food insecure. Graduate students, for example, are often food insecure. Sometimes we joke about having the top ramen, but it isn't really funny that our planet is facing a food crisis. I think that as we all think about pollination and we know about beehive collapses, we need to take the these things as critical warning signs. And now even in our everyday lives, we can notice changing climate. And that is very shocking. We have wildfires occurring, just as Dr. Klaus said, all over the world. And we're going to need to figure out what we do as a population to keep ourselves safe and to continue to exist on this planet. When we're thinking about that, obviously we're veterinarians and we're worried about this huge impact that we are seeing on the planet, and we're in the midst of this sixth mass extinction of plants and animals. And I think we will be faced as a profession and asked how we can contribute to saving species, and which species are so conservation dependent that we have to let them go. Of course, none of us want to think about that, but it's unclear and very doubtful that most species will be able to adapt as quickly as their environment is adapting. And so again, Dr. Klaus showed you the polar bear. We're going to talk a little bit about the Arctic here today, because we absolutely can observe in real time the climate crisis and the changing environment in the Arctic, but that doesn't mean that it's not impacting all of us around the world. So these species, some of whom are mentioned, are climate refugees, but so are we as people. This is another map for another animal species, humans, and the climate refugees that we're seeing around the world from storms and drought, not to mention wildfires, again, that are plaguing many of our home areas. So I'd just like to start with a little veterinary story about really how can we make these correlations to climate change to the world, and especially your clients, because you are a leader in your community. There are so many direct effects of climate change, but the timelines for these are often so protracted that the average citizen thinks, how can I really make a difference? What can I do in my life that's going to change the tack of this horrible path we're on? And what I'd like to say is we can document and we can make the arguments that help us to explain and show evidence that life on this planet is changing. And one area where I've been able to be involved is together in the Pacific Northwest. We were starting to see diseases that really weren't looking right to us in sea otters, in stellar sea lions, in other species, and we were concerned. And what happened was obviously a veterinary investigation that led us to recognize that it appeared that new pathogens were coming into the Pacific Ocean, never before seen in the Pacific Ocean. So we were documenting, again, in those threatened and endangered species that get monitored more closely, that there was phocine distemper virus that was really only seen in the Atlantic and in Northern Europe, but there it was causing dramatic declines and had been causing dramatic declines in seal populations. By looking at and tracking serologically backwards into archives that, again, veterinarians and conservation biologists were collecting of our marine mammals, we could start to see when these new pathogens were being introduced. And we could overlay that with sea ice changes in the Arctic. So on the right here, on the left, you see all these overlapping species distributions, but on the right, we have the sea ice, and you can see that the sea ice was closed in that top frame in September of 1988, and then jump ahead to 2005, you can see clearly that there is the ability for species to migrate from one ocean to another that never had the ability to do that before, at least as long as we've been monitoring them with modern science. And to be able to document that helped us, obviously, to understand what was going on in those populations that we were worried about, but maybe bigger picture, it allowed us to actually show a direct effect of a health issue, not necessarily in humans in this way, right? But a health issue transferring as a direct result of climate change. And in order to more fully document that, we actually collaborated across many agencies and organizations to look at and get more telemetry done on those different species, the species that might be the bridge that that go between now and the Atlantic and the Pacific. And so we were able to look at many species and identify, yes, that they were actually transiting across the previously closed iced areas. And so when we think about this climate change issue, of course, just now I'm speaking to you about ice loss. Ocean acidification is another one, but this is just a little exemplar of the kinds of changes that we see with changes in migration patterns. Now, many people, another easier demonstration is to think about vectors. And so when we think about vector-borne diseases, obviously vectors are very closely tied to their climatological niche. And if you change that climatological niche, you are changing the vector distribution and the diseases, the vector-borne diseases that they carry. But this is not just limited to vectors, it's just easier for us to observe in vectors. Certainly diseases of domestic and wild animals and plants and humans are also a big concern. And what I would like us to walk away with today is the knowledge that all of these things are completely connected. We are disrupting the synchrony between interacting species by our actions for centuries that are causing this climate crisis. And I do believe that we have the intellect, the potential, everything we need scientifically to act on this and hopefully slow, if not reverse, the change that we have already been observing. But we need to absolutely act now. And we need the evidence base to convince our colleagues, your clients, our friends, our families, that that's the right thing to do. And we have that capacity because we have those examples in veterinary medicine. And as we know, we are very vulnerable. So we can't talk about the crises that veterinarians are helping to face and what the world is experiencing without thinking about COVID-19. And I have been working in emerging infectious diseases in places like this all over the world for more than a decade. And I can tell you that the drivers of climate crisis and many other crises that we're experiencing are the same, one and the same as that are driving our exposure and increased risk to emerging infectious diseases. Now, we can't eliminate every contact, we can't protect every species, but we can think more holistically about how we tread on this earth, interact on this earth, and get ourselves into trouble. And from an infectious disease perspective, that's how we get ourselves into exposure risk. So I'm so pleased to be here with you all today, thinking about and talking about One Health, or that interesting activity where we holistically come together to try to work on some of the world's most wicked problems. For emerging infectious diseases, the vectors I already mentioned, the wildlife I already mentioned, they are changing their distribution patterns, but we are also, back to that food supply issue, dramatically changing the way we produce and interact with food, especially in this case, our domestic animal species, who can be hosts and evolutionary changing mixing vessels for some of the organisms that humans just haven't been exposed to in the past. And so it is from this kind of green area, the zoonotic pool of viruses that we don't have evolutionary history with, that we expect these pathogens like SARS-CoV-2 to spill over either directly into people or into other intermediate hosts where they might cook along, maybe even change a bit before spilling into people. And so what I really want you to know is this is not a desperate situation either. We have the ability to change our behavior, think ahead. Instead of waiting for the next infectious disease to hit us and not having any way to really control it until it's moving and dying out, we can be ready, we can forecast, we can improve our detections, our surveillance systems, our laboratories, so that we can jump in and respond. And I had the honor, sorry, it's not advancing. There we go. I had the honor of working with people in more than 30 countries around the world over, again, more than the past decade to do just that. We were able to infect, I like to say, almost 7,000 individuals with the One Health approach, training both laboratorians and field folks and veterinarians and policymakers and public health professionals to really think and get ahead of the curve, if you will, for emerging infectious diseases. And by doing that, we sampled 164,000 individuals, mostly wildlife, but also domestic animal and people. And we trained more than 60 laboratories to do viral detection and discovery, so they don't have to wait for a box to be able to be checked on a form when you submit a blood sample to say, what is in this sample? What is making my patient sick? And while we were doing that, we were developing all these protocols. We also discovered a lot of virus. We discovered novel viruses, more than 160 new coronaviruses, almost 1,000 new viruses in viral families that can cause disease in people. And also documenting more than 200 known viruses in new areas and in new species to help us understand that exposure map and change our behavior and how we relate to those species. Now, we didn't end up finding SARS-CoV-2 before the horrible spillover, but we did find so many other viruses that gave us clues into how to control SARS-CoV-2. We weren't working in the area of China where it emerged, but I can tell you that we found many Sarbeco coronaviruses and the SARS-related coronaviruses, and we could tell the public health community that they should be looking in rhinophilid and hippocytarid bats, because that's where the majority of these viruses were being found. We also could start to document, again, the patterns of host range, home range, and migration of these species and say, hey, it's not just up here in this part of China where we need to be worried about this, but it's all through Southeast Asia and parts of South Asia where we are sensitive to these SARS-related coronaviruses or vulnerable, not vulnerable to the virus, it's not going to leap out and get us, but vulnerable to our own behavioral changes that are putting us at risk. And just as an example, in Vietnam, we were able to work with hunters, trappers, farmers, restaurant workers, and find that coronaviruses were in about 20% of the rodents where people were hunting for rodents for food or bringing them in for farming for food. And then when they got to the large markets and were traded and were put into dense circumstances, this is not a surprise to any veterinarian, but it seems to surprise the general public that you crowd animals together, they get more infectious diseases, they get stressed, and you mix them with other species, they're going to find viruses that they may not have been exposed to, available for remixing, available for infection. The very scary part is by the time we got to the restaurant, the prevalence in those rodents being butchered at the restaurant and fed to people was that over 50% of them were infected with coronaviruses. So this COVID-19 pandemic is devastating. It's terrible. We're living with it, but it is not going to be the end if we don't change our behavior. And the climate crisis is not going to end if we don't change our behavior. All of the behaviors that are causing these dramatic crises are linked and they are interactive with each other. And so when we use this One Health collaborative approach, we also need to be bringing in all of the disciplines that we sometimes don't think about, including social scientists. All of us probably know now that we should have done better with communications, right? And we should have been thinking about how people receive information. You are at that front line. You are in your community. You are a leader in your community. And we really hope by the end of this forum, we can convince you to be an advocate for change. And one way to do that is continue to grow the next generation. I'm very pleased to be working in One Health education. We're doing a short course right now called RX One Health. We usually do it in Tanzania. We had to adapt it to California, and now we had to move it because of wildfires at the last minute. So they're really immersed in these crises because they're being shifted constantly. And then down below, you can see we're working in, again, countries all throughout Southeast Asia and Africa to bring together all the different disciplines, veterinarians, epidemiologists, yes, but also physicians, nurses, environmental advocates, pharmacists. And we really have the ability to use our talents, our education, our science to promote change. And I think I'll end it there because I can't advance the slides anymore, and I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mazet, for that excellent presentation and starting us off with such a great foundation. And now I want to welcome our second speaker, Dr. Courtney Howard, to our virtual stage. Dr. Courtney Howard is an emergency physician in Yellowknife and a clinical associate professor in the Cummings School of Medicine at the University of Calgary. She's an internationally recognized expert on the impacts of climate change on health and in the broader field of planetary health. Her contributions to planetary health are extensive. She was the first author on the 2017 to 2019 Lancet Countdown on Health and Climate Change briefings for the Canadian policymakers, as well as the 2018 International Policy Director for the Lancet Countdown on Health and Climate Change. Dr. Howard was the first female board president for the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, or CAPE. She has also sat on the boards of Ecology North, the Canadian Medical Association, and Health and Harmony, represented CAPE on the board of the Global Climate and Health Alliance, and being the co-chair of the advocacy subcommittee of the WHO Civil Society Working Group on Climate Change and Health. She has also sat on the steering committee of the Planetary Health Alliance and the editorial advisory board of the Lancet Planetary Health. We're very fortunate to have Dr. Howard here with us today, so welcome, Dr. Howard.
Thanks so much for having me. And it's really great to see this level of collaboration between veterinarian science and medical science. I appreciate it. As was just said by the last speaker, this is multidisciplinary work, and the more we're all discussing these issues with one another, the better. So I'm here in Tinaxa traditional territory in what is now known as British Columbia, in my cousin's basement, which explains the very exciting backdrop that you see. And hopefully the tech will all work well and a small child won't burst through the door. So I did my first learning about climate change as a new emergency physician. So I had just graduated from McGill. I wanted to work for Doctors Without Borders, and I was on my way north to Inuvik, which is north of the Arctic Circle. And I happened to pick up a book on the oil sands in the Edmonton airport. And I had not read anything about climate change whatsoever. I was a dancer. I thought I was going to be an athletic, sort of a sports med doc. But on my way north, I realized that as I was reading this book, I had not been taught about the biggest emergency. And I got off the plane in Inuvik. It was the middle of the winter. The internet was very slow. I did a lit review and happened to just pull up the Lancet's first commission on climate change and health, which said that climate change is the biggest health threat of the 21st century. And I was quite angry, actually, at all of the universities where I'd spent my 20s for not teaching me about that university, but at the same time, very grateful for the people who had done the work. And so I went around asking people, and some of you may experience this if this is one of your first interactions with this topic, or possibly also with all the wildfires and the heat that's coming. When you look at the psychological reaction of somebody who's first experiencing what's called a normative conflict, so a new awareness that the world is not where it needs to be, the tendency is to talk to everybody about it. So I did that in Inuvik, and it turns out that Inuvik is actually 3 degrees Celsius warmer than it was when an 80-year-old elder was born. So I actually took the photo in the background of the slide there on my way from Inuvik to Aklavik, which is a little nursing station on a sandbar in the Mackenzie River. And you can see that that river in the photo is in fact just freezing. So it was just the beginning of winter. That river is actually a highway for people once it's frozen. And so it's how people cheaply transport goods and building supplies. It's how people hunt. It's very expensive up there. And when you talk to the elders, they say, look, all our traditional foods are moving around. So in fact, at one point a couple of years ago, I now live in the subarctic. We flew all people down from all of the little communities, and we sat around a table in Yellowknife, which is the sort of big center where we live. And we had a picture of the territory. And we asked people to draw on this paper picture of the territory what changes they'd seen in their lifetime. And so we had elders from Tuktoyaktuk, from Port McPherson, from all these different places, basically drawing arrows all over the place. So the beavers used to be here, now they're over here. The good fish used to be here, now they're here. I saw a moose over here. I've never seen that before. My husband saw it. And so by the time we were done, the entire map was just crisscrossed with different arrows. And so we're warming at one of the most rapid rates in the world. That's what the people who know the land best describe. And so to just give you a sense of where we're heading, as the rest of the world starts to warm to a greater degree. Here in Canada, we're warming at double the global rate. In the north, we're warming at triple the global rate. We're going to see more species moving to different places. And of course, as you know, that leads to more potential for different interactions between species and vectors and also people. And of course, potential for zoonotic disease spillover. So there's really a lot going on. I'm trying this super fun slide advance. It works, yay! And so I literature yesterday, and it was sort of fun I thought about talking about this. So congratulations to everybody. And I wanted to just make sure that I was addressing what seemed to be what people wanted to talk about. And I was really glad to see some of these ideas in this publication. So the idea that veterinarians need to be part of the dialogue, that we need to talk about food systems management, conservation, animal welfare, public health, and the disruptive leadership is required. And I will go into that more in terms of what we've done here in the medical world. And I like your core ideology for the veterinarians' climate change vision to be a steward of healthy animal populations and biodiversity as they relate to ecosystems and society. These are very aligned with what we've been talking about in terms of human health. So when I first became an emergency doctor, I really thought that time learning how to be an emerge doc. And as you heard, I realized later that that wasn't the whole thing. And so I now understand essentially that we live in what I often refer to as a planetary health nest. And so as you describe this to people, you'll find that people really have their thinking in boxes. And this is one of the best ways I've found to describe it to people. So I talk about the ecological determinants of health as being things like soil, water, the climate, different energetic inputs, and that being the platform upon which we build financial structures, societal structures, and those give rise to what we refer to, at least in the medical professions, as the social and structural determinants of health. And those, if that's all going really well, and we can staff and supply and have electricity working, we get to have a healthcare system for people. And when you think about that, you know, in medicine, we sometimes our ego gets away from us and we think we have more to do with the overall health outcomes for people than we do. But really, when you look at studies from across nations, healthcare itself really only accounts for about 25 to 25% of overall health outcome. And so what this slide really communicates to people is that there are so many different inputs into people's health, and that our ability to provide healthcare not only is only a minority component of the overall health outcomes, but it is utterly dependent on everything else functioning. And this used to be tough to get across to people because we had this feeling of sort of non-vulnerability that I think COVID has actually disrupted. So when we talk about supply chains now, people are like, oh yeah, we had supply chain problems, PPE, vaccines, et cetera. So in some ways, COVID, I think, has helped us get to the point where we're almost ready for this conversation, which we weren't before. If you find this helpful, it's in a publication, The Lancet Planetary Health. So when we talk about warming curves for Canada, it's helpful to talk about it in terms of the health of a child born today, because people process that, even just the simple math involved in subtracting 20 or 30 years doesn't land in the same way as thinking about the health of children. And the communications of this around the health of children and the welfare of future generations has been shown by climate communicators to be one of the best ways to motivate populations across the political spectrum to action. So this is my standard way of communicating it. So I think about Matthias. This is my sister's best friend, little guy. He ended up actually needing to get evacuated emergently out of Fort McMurray when the wildfire there caused the evacuation of the city. And what is interesting is that, you know, when you talk about children, it just depoliticizes everything. So little Matthias, this is from the Canada's Changing Climate Report, and this information has not landed. So you're going to have to communicate over and over and over and over and over the reality of continued climate change to people, because I think that the mitigation message came through relatively loud and clear. We need to decrease greenhouse gas emissions so the climate won't change further. However, that's not actually where we're headed. As you can see here, we're committed to about 1.8 to 2 degrees Celsius of warming in Canada by 2040, when Matthias is only going to be in his early 20s, as compared to a new baseline established between 1986 and 2005. I have said this at least 100 times in 100 presentations over the last year or so, and every single time the audience looks surprised. That is a giant problem, because I presented to senators, MPs, architects, doctors. We're not taking these predictions into account as we build our new hospitals, our new infrastructure, as we create our new programs. I think that the current wildfires are helping to move the reality of continued warming into our common vision for the future. But just in the last week, Jonathan Wilkinson, our environment minister, said this is a new normal with regards to the wildfires. We are not at a new normal. If you remember one thing from this presentation, please remember that we are not at a new normal, because that would imply a flat line, right? We're not on a flat line. We're on a continuously increasing line. And if we really, so basically the blue line there is the low emissions pathway. So if we hit the ultra low emissions pathway in IPCC, we have a chance of flattening out in the latter part of the century. Right now, we're tracking the red line. We're tracking the high emissions pathway, which here in Canada would see us at about 6.3 degrees Celsius of warming. So we have an adaptation sprint, and we have started to, within healthcare systems, survey different facilities to find out what kind of climate-related problems they're already having, because this impacts our ability to actually do our jobs. And so they've detailed damaged infrastructure, stress, mental health, emergency plans being activated, disruption to services like dialysis. There was huge. Fort McMurray Hospital had to get evacuated in a matter of hours. Other BC healthcare facilities were evacuated during the wildfires in 2017. So it's important for us to track these and report them, because it starts to make clear what the actual impacts are to care provision, which is sort of, I've found a whole different level of practical, the practicality of it is really concrete for people, and it makes them motivated to start to work. So I found that this has been helpful, but there isn't a lot of work. Luckily, so CAPE Doctors, the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, just joined this Climate Proof Canada coalition that started up just in late June. And I'd really encourage the veterinarians to take a look at their website, because it's actually quite a conservative group who's come together. It's a lot of insurance providers, some of the more conservative NGOs, et cetera. And it's run by actually the former executive director of our group, who's one of the smartest people I know, Robin Hedger. So he's really been doing a lot of advocacy with the different the different parties as they put their potential election platforms together to say, hey, we need a national climate adaptation plan. We need a person who can work between silos in terms of disaster response. We need a different way of collecting data. And so the more of us who are sort of combined with the same asks, the more progress we're going to make. And we just need to keep driving home we are not at a new normal, because this is where we're headed. By 2080, he's only going to be 63, Matthias. Like, this is not old, as I'm 42 now. 63 doesn't seem very old. Like, we need to get going for Matthias. We have so much work to do. And so here in Canada, we've been crappy at this at mitigating greenhouse we've almost increased by 43.8% anyone. And this has to over 10 years ago. They've had cross-party consensus. They've depoliticized a party that's arguing. I just want you to know this is possible. And so when we think about this, if you're feeling sad, if you're feeling anxious, if you're feeling angry, if you're feeling guilty, please know that is entirely normal. And the more we can be open and honest about those feelings, the better. Because at the end of the day, we know we have the technological solutions we need at the prices that we require for at least the immediate response for both adaptation and mitigation. And so what that means is this is a humans getting along challenge. Like, what we have right now is a human mobilization challenge primarily. And humans do our best work when we come in to have conversations from a centered place. And so you'll find right now that there's energy, there's emotions going everywhere. And as an emergency doctor and you as clinical veterinarians, you do your best work when you're emotionally centered. And so it's going to be necessary for everybody to do their grief work, care, and to really, that is in fact what will take us to our centered place so that we can enter our decision-making spaces and be ready to buffer whatever energy people bring towards us and be as strategic as we would want to be in any emergency response scenario. And this is just a graph showing how much internet searches for eco-anxiety and ecological grief, et cetera, have really gone up in the last few years. So important to realize it could always be worse, right? You could always have horrible dental pain And so it's really, I used to feel like if I wasn't working all the time, I wasn't doing my job. But the reality is that the arms of your children around you, the beauty of the natural world, time to exercise are what's going to give you the energy to do the work with a full bucket. And so as much as you can appreciate the beauty of the present moment, the better. So making a plan, action alleviates anxiety. And this is Nick Watts, my former boss at the Lancet Countdown. As a med student, he would say, we're too young to know what's impossible, so we do it anyway. So, the cynic is always right. The person who says we can't do it is always right, because it's automatically, you stop trying. And so I would encourage you to aim high. Humans can do incredible things. And so who tells the story? It's important to know that we all have pull. So we all have the ability to influence those around us and decision makers. So the previous speaker was mentioning the importance of veterinarians raising their voice. And yes, 100%. Common sort of progress along the advocacy curve is we're freaked out and we tell everybody. And then we think that if we tell people a ton of things, they're going to do something about it. But the thing is, that person doesn't have a clue like what they're supposed to do. And so relaying evidence, I try, and everything I say to you, I have tried. So I did the mistakes, so you don't have to. So just telling evidence to people, like I used to submit motions that had I was the only person at the Canadian Medical Association that had appendices to my motions. Nobody cares. If you're the person at the buffet table who makes them feel sad and guilty, and they're like, I'm going to go to the bathroom now, you've kind of not quite hit the energetic sweet spot, okay? How you make people feel is actually truly more important a lot of the time than the data you provide. And that's a tough truth for nerds, but it's true. Okay, so if this is what your audience is looking like, you got to mix it up. And really listen to the communications advice. Get media training before you think you need it. Media works on an hour-long timeline. If you can't say yes in a couple of hours, you're going to miss the opportunity, and it's hard to get media. You don't want to miss the opportunity. Have your next interaction together be media training. It's possible to do over Zoom. It works fine. And you need to each come up with a story about why you're doing the work. Because, there's a reason I started with that story about Inuvik. There's evidence around the trustedness of messengers that up with your personal story of motivation as to why you're doing this, and get used to telling it sort of crisply. That is not enough. You need to work it into policy, and then you need to do advocacy to make that happen in the real world. And that can involve meaningfully targeted action. When I first started doing this, I was like, we need to solve climate change. And Gideon Foreman was CAPE's executive director at the time. He was like, well, what's your target? I was like, what do you mean target? What's a target? And he said, Courtney, you need a target. And so this is how I now understand change making. So you pick a target that you want to change. You get the team together to do the change. You pick that target from an evidence-based strategic way. You have a story to tell about the target. So when we did cold phase out, it was all about preventing asthma exacerbations in children. We weren't talking about greenhouse gas emissions. We were talking about preventing asthma exacerbations. And then you use different tactics, whether it's surveys that you can then report, whether it's press releases, whether it's a protest, whether it's meetings with decision makers, different tactics. Win your target, win it, then tell everybody. Because people actually like to jump on bandwagons. Once you start winning things, you'll be amazed at how many people want to be on your team, okay? So the targets can be chosen at different levels. So I think of it as a ladder of engagement. Micro is individual level practice change. Meso is hospital level. So things we're talking about now in my circles are phasing out anesthetic gases that have a really high greenhouse warming potential, switching to meter dose from meter dose inhalers, dry powdered inhalers. So those are departmental organizational change things. And then you tell everybody, it's in the newsletter. They're like, hey, that person over there is doing good things. And then after that, you can choose a bigger target and say, hey, we're going to work on cool phase out. And now you kind of know your stuff because you did the other things. and you've made some of your mistakes where nobody could see and nobody cared, and you're ready for sort of the bigger leagues and to talk to decision makers and media at a different level. So think about it in terms of iterative change making. And some people are really, really good at target selection. And to me, that's the creative fun part of a lot of it. So these are just a few of the things that we've done. So essentially, animals, so I don't really know. And has committed to net zero. It's important for us to do that as well. So and I think that the more you all work together, leading by example makes a difference. Commuting is something that we've done phase that we've been very, very successful with at the national. Important to have very diverse groups at the decision-making and action tables. You'll find people bring different perspectives. If I look around, and so making sure that I look at it now as humanity, something that matters. Doing Philpott's food guide was super, super important, and it wouldn't have happened if she hadn't been there. And in terms of what I would like to see from this community, this report from the National Farmers Union is really worth reading. It is really built around a corporate model that isn't at all helpful for food security or animals. And so the more we can coordinate around food, both in terms of adaptation and mitigation, the better. Because at this point,